Are you searching for fulfillment? Discover true happiness. Stay tuned to Shalom World.
Hooray!
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Go!
Your voice and melt my heart. You look in me, set me alive. You call my name and I am whole. You store in me unending hope. To me deeper now. You're all I need. Tune out my life. Your love is louder. Louder. Your love is louder. Louder. Your love is louder. Louder. Your love is louder. Your love is louder.
Hi, this is Karen. I'm here at Ignite Conference and we're about to get started with a workshop by Brendan Malone. Brendan, can you tell us a bit about what your workshop will be about?
I'm going to be talking about a Catholic response to transgenderism, one of the really highly politicised issues of the day, and I'm going to try and unpack that. What does the data, what does the science show us? And I guess most importantly, what does an authentically Catholic pastoral response to this very difficult and highly politicised issue actually look like?
Okay, and I know you've been kind of talking around topics like pro-life, marriage and things for about 15 years, but how long has it been since you've actually had to talk on this topic?
Well, this is something new, and I start the talk by explaining that about 14 years ago, this was something that was more an anecdote, and now it's become an extreme mainstream ideology. So in the last few years, it's become more and more of a common issue for me.
Okay, and what are some of the main kind of comments or topics that you'll be covering today?
Well, as I said, I'll be looking at the science to show what that tells us. We'll be looking at some of the basics of Catholic teaching, and then most importantly, how do we respond to that with love? Let me start with an anecdote. It's a true anecdote. This happened to me about 11 years ago, and I was at a university in New Zealand to talk about the issue of abortion at a public meeting, and there was a young lady there who was doing, I think it was feminist studies or women's studies, something along those lines. She was probably third year. She was an astute, intelligent woman, and she said to me, just out of the blue, she said, "You keep talking about females." She said, "But you do realise that masculinity and femininity, males and females, they don't exist." And I said, "Oh, please do tell me more, because I may have been using the wrong toilet all these years." And this was a joke back then, okay, seriously. Now, and she said to me, well, she was serious. She said, "You're a male because you believe you're a male and because your friends treat you as a male. But if you believed you're a female and your friends treated you as a female, then you would be a female." Now, at this point, I thought, okay, I've got to ask her some obvious questions. And by the way, if you ever engaged in a controversial topic with anyone, never underestimate the power of a question. You can say a lot of very bold and declarative things just by asking people to contemplate the actual truth and logic of the position that they hold. Instead of trying to correct them and tell them they're wrong, invite them to consider perhaps where they might be wrong. You'll find you're inviting them to dialogue. It's a far more effective way of doing things. So I said to her, well, I've got some questions, and I said, please bear with me. This is going to sound silly, but what if I believe that I am a chicken? And she said to me, what do you mean? And I said, well, from a very young age, I knew I was different. I I was attracted to roosters at school. This is truly how this conversation went. I was attracted to roosters. Whenever we had a school disco, all I wanted to hear was the birdie dance over and over again. You know that one. And when I go to see my friends, they turn my food into pellets and they throw it around on the floor and I wander around picking it up. So my friends treat me as a chicken. I believe I'm a chicken. I must be a chicken, right? Now, I did that on purpose. I took it to the extreme because I wanted her to say, don't be so stupid. And then I could say, okay, so we've got a point of reality we can agree on. Let's work back and see how that might relate to gender. She didn't. She looked at me, dead serious, and said, well, I suppose you would be a chicken then. And I was waiting at this point for her to say, no, don't be so stupid, you've taken it too far or something. She didn't. Now, at this point, I started to ask her the next obvious question that occurred to me. Unfortunately, we had to end the conversation early, but I said to her, well, what if I believe I don't exist? I don't exist. My friends all ignore me because they treat me as if I don't exist. If I was to reach into your bag now and steal something, I'm not guilty of a crime because I don't exist, right? And unfortunately, the conversation, as I said, came to a rather premature end. Now, the reason I'm starting with that is because I used to tell that anecdote in all sorts of places. Sorry, batteries are not working for us tonight. I used to tell that anecdote in all sorts of places, and you could tell it in any audience, and people saw the humour in that. They understood perhaps what was logically deficient about that position. That now is an actual mainstream ideology that is being ingrained, more and more ingrained into public and educational and all sorts of other important policy areas. Things have shifted massively on this issue. To a point where that would be told as a joke to now people saying, well, no, that's actually a legitimate and very serious idea to hold. So let's clarify some of the terms and perhaps look at a little bit about how we got here. So first of all, gender identity. Basically, when you hear that term being used by those who would subscribe to what I call maybe the transgender ideology or the gender theory ideology, is that basically the term gender identity means the gender you identify as regardless of your birth sex. Okay, so they make a distinction between gender and what your birth sex actually is. Gender expression is the term they use to describe the way that someone communicates their gender to others through external means, such as clothing, appearance, and mannerisms. Transgender is someone who identifies as the opposite of their biological sex, e.g. a transgender woman was someone who was born a male but now identifies as a female. A transgender man was born female but now identifies as a male. This word, to show you how recent this word is, the earliest, and this is according to the Merriam Dictionary, the earliest reference we have is somewhere in the 1970s for that word. Before that, it doesn't exist as a concept. It's very much coming on the back of a lot of sort of postmodern ideas and very relativistic ideas that are sort of starting to hit the universities around the late 60s. Gender fluid is a term that you'll hear used to describe someone who changes back and forth between male and female for any reason. Now bear with me because there's still more to this ideology. I can see some of you thinking, man, this is really quite intense. Well, it's going to get more intense, okay? Bi gender is someone who is both male and female at the same time. Someone who says I'm genderqueer or agender or third gendered, they are neither male nor female and doesn't want to be identified as any gender. Someone who is a transvestite or a cross-dresser is not necessarily transgender. Just honestly, the terms are all over the show now, but just to clarify, commonly they are heterosexual or bisexual males who wear women's clothing often associated with sexual arousal. Okay, so a transvestite may actually have nothing at all to do with someone who identifies as transgender. To transition is the term to describe the process of changing your behaviour, your dress, your name, and your preferred pronoun. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that's what we call social transitioning. Or, if you go to the next stage, hormone treatments and sometimes surgery, and that's what we call medical transitioning, where the body is changed in an attempt to transition from one gender to another. Personal pronouns. These are the terms that people use to refer to themselves. They, them, theirs, instead of he or she. So, Brendan ate their food because they were hungry. And I have read some absurdly crafted newspaper articles trying to use that type of pronoun description. You read it and you think, what's going on? It doesn't make sense. There's a woman in New Zealand who identifies as a man and is pregnant and is claiming that she is the first male in New Zealand to be pregnant, but she also wants to use these pronouns, and you're reading about them and their pregnancy, and it's one person. And you're thinking, what's going on? It's so confusing to read. Brendan ate hair food because Z was hungry. Now, where does this come from? So, originally, Z was C, which is the German word for female. And so it's a feminine pronoun, so they changed it to Z. Her was a feminine pronoun that is found in Middle English. Cisgendered or cis is the opposite of transgendered. That is and it's often used as a passive-aggressive or derogatory label for those who don't accept the transgender ideology. Oh, you would say that you're cisgendered. Okay, so I'm cisgendered according to this ideology. This word, the earliest reference we have to it is 1994. So this does not have a long pedigree at all, just to show you how recent and how quick some of these shifts are happening. Your sex assigned at birth. And this is the phrase used by adherents to the transgender ideology to describe your natal. Natal is another way of saying birth, so your birth sex or your natal sex, the sex you were born. And what they believe is that you weren't born male or female, a doctor or your parents assigned you male or female at birth. They didn't look at you and go, okay, that's a boy or a girl. They said, we're assigning this human being boyness or girlness, okay? Now, there's a particular tool that is used by those who are adherents to this ideology that you will see a lot. I know it's being used here in Australia. It's starting to make an appearance in New Zealand, called the gender unicorn. Has anyone heard of the gender unicorn? So the gender unicorn is used in schools, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So gender identity, what do you identify as? Gender expression, so you might identify as a female but express masculine. Sex assigned at birth, male, female, other, intersex. Who are you physically attracted to? Could be any one of these. And who are you emotionally attracted to? Could be any one of these. Now, just imagine trying to navigate that as a young person who's very vulnerable and trying to ascertain who the heck am I in relation to not just the world around me, but myself. Who am I? And there's a lot of very vulnerable people. And there's some interesting research now starting to come to the fore about the nature of households in which this is a very common occurrence now, where people experience confusion about their own gender and identity. And the parents seem to be, and this is hardly surprising, a hugely informative and influential factor in the lives of those young people. This is effectively, the best summation of this ideology is this fits perfectly into the category of something that Pope Benedict XVI referred to. He gave an address to the members of the Diplomatic Corps on the 10th of January 2011, and he described ideologies that were like this: courses of sexual or civic education which allegedly convey a neutral conception of the person and of life, yet in fact reflect an anthropology that is opposed to faith and to right reason. And I would say on all measures, this absolutely fails that test. From a faith perspective, for us as Catholics, it really doesn't get any clearer than this. Masculinity and femininity are profoundly important. The scriptures tell us this. Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Does anybody know what that scripture says? Even a loose transliteration is fine. Very good. Male and female, he created them, and we are created in the image of God. Male and female, he made them. Okay? So it's pretty clear. And our bodies profoundly image who God is, and they image the Trinity. Males and females engaged in the sexual act that is open to the fullness of life, it is fruitful, just like the Trinity. There's a fruitfulness. The love between the Father and Son flows forth in the Holy Spirit. This is quite profound. And so for us, on that point, it's clear, but is that just an article of faith? This is a very common thing these days. Well, that's just your Catholic belief, all right? But we live in a society that's not Catholic, so, people might choose to have a different belief on this. What about their choice to choose differently? Well, let's look at the science and what that shows us, because this is hugely important. And to me, one of the big astounding things about this particular ideology is the way in which it is so contrary to science in an age where, even if you were to say, like I did to someone recently, I have concerns about what I would call climate alarmism. There's a lot of it out there right now, and it just isn't backed up by the science. The idea that the planet is going to be gone in 18 months or 10 years. And it's an absurdity. That's not what the science shows us. The science shows us about the impact of man on the climate, but it doesn't show us the planet's going to be gone in 18 months or 10 years. And so you get these sort of extremes of alarmism. But even to question that, you'll have people who will really strongly resist, and they will say, the science is settled. And you're like, yeah, I've got no problem with that, but the extremism's a whole different story altogether. And in an age where we are so willing to say the science is settled on that issue, where the science is even more settled, we completely ignore it on this particular issue, male-femaleness. Let's look at some of that science. So let's start, first of all, with intersex conditions. So an intersex person is someone who has physical or developmental, hormonal, and other gender markers which do not conform to what is typical for male or female bodies. That's what an intersex person is. And please understand, this is completely different to transgenderism, or someone who says, I'm transgender or queer gender or agender or any of those other terms we looked at before. This is an actual condition. In fact, it's actually considered a birth defect. And two categories of this are actually quite serious, and the people have to be monitored because there are some serious health implications associated with it. And as you'll see, it's not the same thing at all, even though the transgender movement is trying to piggyback onto the back of this to give a certain credence to what they are claiming. Intersex conditions occur in roughly 1 in 2,000 births. This is a birth defect, as I've said, and the majority of intersex people still happily identify as either male or female and display the usual male or female gender traits. Many have surgery if this is required to create normal sexual organs if there's some sort of dysfunction there. There's not that same confusion of identity that you will find with transgenderism. This is interesting. Medical science doesn't recognise intersex as another gender. This is really important. It's not the same as saying, oh, there's a third gender. It's not what the science tells us at all, but rather a departure from the normal development of gender. It's a defect in the way that that biological reality has failed to express itself as it normally should have. Here's an interesting quote that comes from the Intersex Society of North America, from their website. Intersex people are perfectly comfortable adopting either a male or female gender identity and are not seeking a genderless society or to label themselves as a member of a third gender class. That's from the website of an intersex society, people who are intersex. Do you see the difference here now? Now, what's happened, though, is the transgender movement has very much tried to piggyback on and hijacked the concept of being intersex as if it also applies to their particular beliefs as well. What does the science show us? Well, the science shows us that gender is a binary, 1 or 2, on or off, male or female. There's a document that the Vatican released just a couple of months ago, the Congregation for Catholic Education. The document, let me give you the full name of it, Male and Female, He Created Them, Towards a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory and Education. And in that document, they explain it really well when they say this. Sexual dimorphism, that is the sexual difference between men and women, can be demonstrated scientifically by such fields as genetics, endocrinology, and neurology, study of the brain. From the point of view of genetics, male cells, which contain XY chromosomes, differ from the very moment of conception from female cells with their XX chromosomes. And that is a very good summation of what the data actually shows us. Now, just to explain something here, male and female differences are on average, they're by design, and they're as a group. What that means is this: exceptions can be found for every example. So if you say, well, generally men are taller, there are sometimes females who are going to be taller. They're going to be the exception, but the exception proves the rule. But on average, and by design, and as a group, the differences between men and women are grounded in biology and have a large impact on both our physiology and our psychology. Another thing I'll say is this: when it comes to our inherent dignity and worth, men and women are equal. I think it's important to clarify this. We are different by design, but equal in worth. This is one of the most profound and important doctrines of Christianity in the development of the West, and a lot of people living in the West today don't even realise it. St. Paul actually spells this out a couple of times in the New Testament. One of the more common ones you've probably heard is this one from Galatians, when he's writing to the church in Galatia. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Now, let me explain. What he's not saying there is gender doesn't exist. What he's saying is there is no moral difference. There is no difference in dignity. We are all morally equal in the eyes of God. This doctrine is profoundly world transforming. Prior to this, prior to Christianity, even the pinnacle of the pagan world, the Greeks and the Romans, did not believe in moral equality. They believed that some people were born better than others. They were born into different types of classes, or some people had more power than others. And it's only because of this doctrine. In fact, we've got secular academics who have written books on this in the last couple of years, who have spelled out, if it wasn't for this doctrine, we wouldn't have a modern framework of human rights. This is where this idea comes from. This is why infanticide stops happening in the ancient world, because Christians don't kill babies either before birth or shortly after like the pagans did, because they said even babies are morally equal. This is quite a profound shift. I once heard a secular academic describe it like this. If you live in the West, even if you're an atheist, the dreams you dream are always Christian dreams, even if you don't know it. And this is an example of that. People take this moral intuition for granted. Oh, yeah, of course we're all morally equal. Well, 2,100 years ago, we didn't believe that at all. This is quite a big shift. Just quickly to explain the difference between respect and dignity, because this goes to human dignity. Respect is an admiration for someone because of qualities, abilities, or achievements they might have. And this is the important bit. Respect is earned and it can come and go. Dignity is your worthiness to be respected as more than an animal or an object. You have a profound worth, and as Catholics we would say that that profound worth comes to you by way of God. And this is the important bit. Dignity can never be lost. Regardless of ability, gender, age, state in life, you are still a living, breathing icon of God. That's profound. That's profoundly important, especially in an age like ours, which is obsessed with functionalism and utilitarianism and what can you do for the economy and what can you do for yourself. Are you able-bodied? Oh, you can't go skydiving. That must be a terrible life. You'd probably want euthanasia, wouldn't you? Right? That's the kind of culture we're now living in more and more and more, because we've lost sight of this important truth. So that males and females equal dignity, just to clarify that point. Let me explain the gender binary a bit more clearly. Let's do a little thought experiment. Imagine we are at a barbecue with a group of families, and there is a loving, stable two-parent family present there. And one of those parents in that two-parent family has the youngest, very young, small child, and that parent is throwing that child in the air as high as they can. The child gets to the arc of the sort of as high as it's going to go, and it's and then it comes down again, and then it goes, do it again, right? That's generally what kids do, or they start crying and run off. And so, that's in my experience anyway. And so, this is a good test. And so, you do it several more times, then the child gets put down, and then the child runs at that parent 100 miles an hour and pretends to sort of have a good old rumble with that parent, and then that parent drops the child on the ground, very lovingly and carefully, of course, and then does a big pretend people's elbow onto the child and has a good old rumble with the child. Which do you think of two parents in a two-parent family is more likely to be doing that with the child, while the other parent stands on, a bit nervously, watching every time the child goes up and every time the people's elbow goes down? Be careful. If I was to say to you, which parent do you think is doing the throwing and the rumbling? Which one do you think is more likely to be doing that? Your dads are, right? This is the gender binary in action, right? Blokes are different from females. Females are different from blokes. We have unique gifts and strengths we bring to the world, unique weaknesses we both bring to the world, and together something good happens. There's a complementarity between men and women that is profoundly important. We image God together. So some of the differences. Well, let's get down to some of the nitty-gritty stuff. Brain size is different. Now, males have a brain that is on average 8 to 13% larger. I don't know what we do with that extra capacity. It's a mystery to me, but we have got, I can't even remember my wife's birthday. So, I'm not sure what I'm doing with all that grey matter, but it is there, okay? And there are also structural and functional differences. I once heard a world-famous neuroscience scientist in the UK saying that she could have a patient who she has never met, has never seen at all, and if they put her into an MRI or put the patient into an MRI, she could tell by the brain scans whether they're male or female. Okay, so this is quite an important difference. Some diseases are sex-specific or sex-related. So, for example, we used to, with drug trials, this was an interesting thing they found with drug trials. They used to just conduct drug trials on male lab rats or male mice to see if they were safe. And then they would release the drugs and they would discover, strangely enough, that male and female physiology were not the same. And there would be these side effects that would appear in female subjects that they didn't get with the males. It's about 10 years ago, they started changing the way they test drugs now. They realised, drugs and physiologies are kind of different and between males and females. This is another one, a good friend of mine here in Australia, actually, who is a doctor in a hospital, and he has a patient who is transgender, but he says despite the fact that that patient is transgender, because of his age, I still have to give him a prostate exam. I just have to, even though he identifies as someone who doesn't normally have a prostate. Males are generally taller and they are generally physically stronger. Females are people-orientated, whereas males tend to be thing-orientated. This is from a good book called Gender, Nature and Nurture by psychologist Richard Lipper. And there was an interesting study in the early 2000s that was done, and it found that females are more likely to be inspired to jealousy by emotional infidelity, whereas males are more likely to be inspired to jealousy by sexual infidelity, whereas the emotional infidelity just didn't register with them. Gender dysphoria. This is the condition of feeling that your gender is the opposite of your biological sex. And gender dysphoria is a very real and traumatic psychological disorder which is not chosen. So someone's not just waking up saying, well, I choose to experience gender dysphoria. It used to be called gender identity disorder, but was renamed to remove the stigma around calling it a disorder. And it does affect people. And it is a very real condition of confusion that people can experience, often at a very vulnerable time in their lives when they are younger. But we're in a position now where gender dysphoria, that confusion, is now being held up as if it's an actual real state of reality. It's another gender. It's another way that you can actually live and that you should embrace it. And this is important because this is a big shift. So how did we get to this point now where gender dysphoria is no longer seen as something that we need to care for someone and assist them to journey through, to a point now where it's being held up as something that you should actually embrace and actively live out? Because this is a very big shift. Think about something like anorexia nervosa, also a dysphoria of sorts, bodily. Person looks at their body, does not believe their body is the right body, and they will do quite extreme things often to try and correct what they think is the problem. We don't say to people with that dysphoria, you should embrace it, celebrate it, live it out, we'll help you to shed weight. We don't. We recognise that we've got to care for and love a person in that state. So why are we not viewing human sex in that same way? How do we get here? Well, there's several reasons, but one of the big reasons at several hundred years ago, in fact, this reason really pops up, and it's thanks to this guy here, René Descartes. Does anybody know what René Descartes is famous for? He lived from 1596 to 1650. What's his famous maxim or motto? Very good. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Now, what Descartes is doing here is Descartes responding to a question that was being asked at the time. How do I know that I actually exist? I had an auntie. She used to come to Christmas lunch and she would say she was into Buddhism. And she's now back into the Catholic faith in a big way, which is a glorious thing. And she used to come to Christmas dinners, though, and she would say, Brendan, how do we not know that we are actually just butterflies dreaming that we're men? And everyone say, okay, auntie, have another sherry and a bit more cake. Because no one was ever quite sure how to get into that conversation because it was always a rabbit hole. Now, basically, this is sort of what René Descartes is tackling. How do I know that I actually exist? And he says this. The fact that you even ask yourself the question, do I exist, is proof that you exist. I think, therefore I exist. If I didn't exist, I couldn't think and I couldn't ask myself that question. So it's a proof of your existence. There's a problem though, because Descartes also creates something called Cartesian dualism, named after him. And what he says is this, that the person is nothing more than a soul, or what we might say today as a consciousness, living inside a body, and your body is nothing more than a machine. And your soul uses your body as a machine to get about the material world, but your body is just a machine. This is the mechanistic view of the world. It is a huge problem, and it sets the West on a trajectory that has been absolutely disastrous for thought and morality ever since. So, first of all, by the way, who's seen Men in Black? Have you seen Men in Black where there's that scene with the alien that looks like a human being and the head opens up? There's a little alien that controls. That's Descartes in a nutshell. If you're sort of trying to get your head around it, that's Descartes, okay? So that's you, the little alien, okay? Now, here's the thing, though. What's wrong with Cartesian dualism? Well, first of all, there's a huge problem. How do you know anything for certain? Because the only way that you have knowledge about the material world, about the world around you, is because your body gives you that knowledge. Your 5 physical senses, touch, taste, sight, sound, and smell, they tell you data. They give you data. But if you're a soul or a consciousness, which is not physical, it's immaterial, how do you know that your body's telling you the truth when it gives you that data? So when you look at this, you say, oh, it's a certain colour, it's a certain shape, it's got so many buttons on it. But that's your body telling you that, according to Descartes. How do you know your body's telling you the truth when it tells you that? And Descartes even began to grapple with that problem. And that's why now we have a lot of relativism and a lot of skepticism in the world. Really hard skepticism. People who will say, well, how can you know anything for certain? To which I always say, well, if you can't know anything for certain, how do you know that we can't know anything for certain? Because the moment you know for certain we can't know anything for certain, you know something for certain. And so you've got a self-refuting proposition there. The other thing, of course, is what he does is he says the person is just a soul or a consciousness. Think about the issue of abortion. You'll hear people say this today. Euthanasia is another one. Oh, they're no longer a person because they don't have consciousness or they haven't developed it yet. That's a Cartesian idea. Transgenderism is on this same spectrum. A body is a machine, it is a thing, but the person is really the consciousness or the soul that inhabits the machine. And that really is what put us on the path to where we are now. Now, Descartes never would have intended this. Never. And he never would have foreseen this. But unfortunately, this is what happens. I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said that a small error in the beginning is often a great error in the end. And this is really a very clear example of this. When you think about this ideology, it is extremely irrational at its heart. Why is it irrational? Well, first of all, psychological beliefs can be wrong and are regularly wrong. Beliefs that people hold about themselves can be wrong. And especially when you think about children who are now being caught up regularly in this ideology, children are generally not rational actors by nature. You want to see my daughter in action when she gets a little bit tired, right? Seriously, trying to even just discern the basics of does she want to go to bed or not can become something that gets blown out of all proportion. Yet children that age and even younger now, we are being told actually have a very strong and clear understanding of who they are to the point they can say, I'm actually not the sex I was born. I'm actually a female trapped inside a male's body. We've already mentioned anorexia nervosa, which is a confusion of bodily dysphoria that a person can experience. But there are other types of bodily dysphorias. A very rare dysphoria is a species dysphoria. There are people who genuinely believe that they were not born human beings, like the chicken question. Some people do believe that they were born another animal. It's very rare. There are also people who experience something called a potomnophilia. A potomnophilia is the belief that you're not supposed to have certain limbs that you were born with. A person looks at their arm and says, no, it's a mistake. I'm supposed to be an amputee from this point here. We don't say to a person in that condition, well, you should embrace that ideology. It's clearly true and will help you change your bodily identity to conform to how you view your body. If gender is a social construct, and this is the big question, why do you need to change your body to change your gender? If gender is a social construct, it's got nothing to do with your body. It exists in your mind, right? So why do you need to change your body if you change your gender? You can't change a social construct with a scalpel. A social construct is not your physicality. It's something completely different. So why do you need to change your physicality to reflect changing gender unless your body does actually have something profound to do with your gender. Another important question that we should be asking more is this largely a social contagion? It's something that's become contagious because it's become sort of prevalent in society to talk about these issues. We are now seeing an increase in what is now being called rapid onset gender dysphoria. This is people who have had no indication at all for most of their life that they've had any confusion about their gender, and then all of a sudden, I don't know, maybe 15 or 16, just bang, out of the blue. Oh no, I'm actually now all of a sudden, I'm confused about my gender. This rapid onset. Now, there are people studying this, and they talk about the fact that this has all the hallmarks of social contagion. I read a paper recently where someone was saying that the incidence or the occurrence of natal females, so people who are born female, who actually experience gender dysphoria to such a point they believe they're a man now, and they become transgender. It was so rare that it was practically non-existent, but now it's actually measurable. That's a big shift and a very recent shift, and that does point to the fact that you're dealing with something here that is not actually an organic occurrence. It is a social contagion. It is something that is constructed. Are drastic surgical interventions really appropriate? Because these are drastic interventions. You can't go back from this. My country, in New Zealand, we just had a wellbeing budget a couple of months ago from our Labor government, and they took $6 million off frontline disability services spending, and they gave $3 million of taxpayer funding to fund gender reassignment surgeries. They are a very expensive form of surgery, $100,000 plus each one, but they're also very drastic. They are a very drastic intervention. Is this really appropriate? Listen to this quote from Paul McHugh from Johns Hopkins University. Sex change is biologically impossible. People who undergo sex reassignment surgery do not change from men to women or vice versa. Rather, they become feminized men or masculinized women. At Hopkins, we stopped doing sex reassignment surgery since producing a satisfied, quote unquote, but still troubled patient seemed an inadequate reason for surgically amputating normal organs. He's a child psychologist at Johns Hopkins University. There's another quote from Renee Jacks, who's a male to female transsexual and author of the book Don't Get on the Plane, Why Sex Change Surgery Will Ruin Your Life, How the Medical Profession Failed to Protect Thousands of Patients from Sexual Mutilation. It's a very long title, isn't it? After the medically certified gender change, life didn't improve. Gender dysphoria, that feeling of unease with one's gender, persisted and was not relieved as promised. And this is a very common occurrence for people. This is a quote from Walter Heyer. Walter Heyer was someone who transitioned to female, then transitioned back. And he's now a speaker and an author on this issue. And he said this in his book: 90% have a significant form of psychopathology. 61% also have other psychiatric disorders and illness. This is people who want to transition. 50% had depressive symptoms. 40% showed symptoms of anxiety. These are extremely high figures. Is it really appropriate for someone who's in that category for us to be saying, we will actually help you to achieve and we will help you to change your body drastically and even permanently, when so many of them experience these very serious issues? Surely, in any other situation, we'd say, well, hold on, maybe we shouldn't be doing the surgery because it seems there's underlying conditions that actually need to be addressed here. I read a fascinating article on the plane over actually about some new data, which is now starting to show that a very high percentage of people who identify as transgender also appear on the spectrum. This is important because people on the spectrum struggle with social identity and how to relate to others and who they are in the world. Now, if that data is consistent and it bears out, then we've got a real serious problem. If we are saying to people who, a large number of whom appear on the spectrum, we will help you completely and drastically change your body and possibly permanently, that is an abuse of those persons. It is not a help for them at all. The autistic spectrum, okay. Why are suicide rates so high? Why are they so high? And including in post-op, people who have transitioned. Suicides are extremely high, rates are extremely high, even in the most LGBT-affirming countries like the Netherlands and Sweden. So some people will try and say, oh, well, this is just because they're not tolerated or accepted, but they're consistently high wherever you go, regardless of social attitudes. Other minority groups that experience discrimination and bullying don't show anywhere near the same high rates of suicide. If it was purely that factor, why wouldn't those groups also show the same high rate? And what's interesting is a lot of people don't realise this, but these suicide rates are so high that they've only been matched in places like the Jewish ghettos of World War II Germany, where Jews were being systematically imprisoned and starved, like the Warsaw Ghetto, which had a suicide rate that sat around 40%. And this is the suicide rate of people who are in that category of transgender. Another important question, what possible justification is there for giving puberty blockers? This article I was reading yesterday about this points out the fact that one of the risks of puberty blockers is infertility. Why would we be doing that to a child? Why would we be interfering with a person's normal development trajectory in such a drastic way? That's abuse. That is not helping someone. Why does policy not recognise the fact that the majority of young people will grow out of gender dysphoria? Now, this is important, and I'm going to lead into perhaps some of our responses to this, what this should look like. This is an important piece of information. If there is a 4% prevalence of gender dysphoria in children, which is what some studies show, now there's reasons to question whether it is that high, but let's take it as read that it is 4% gender dysphoria amongst children. The adult prevalence is only 0.002%. What that means is that over 99% of people will grow out of gender dysphoria by adulthood if you don't interfere. Why are we interfering if the data shows that? Again, this is an abuse of persons. It is not helping. So how should we respond to this serious issue? Because really that's the million-dollar question. Well, the document I quoted before, Male and Female, he created them, proposes a very good model, a 3-stage model. It calls listen, reason, and propose. Listen, reason, and propose. Let me read you a quote from that document. The church, mother and teacher, does more than simply listen, remaining rooted in her original mission and at the same time always open to the contribution of reason. She puts herself at the service of the community of peoples, offering it a way of living. Remember, Jesus tells us this, that the fullness of life is found where? In him. There is no real world without Christ. So often I hear people say to me, well, in the real world though, sure, my Christianity says this, but in the real world, there is no real world without Christ. What you're saying is in the alternate reality, which is more comfortable and easier to live. That's what you really mean. Okay, so it offers people a way of living, the fullness of living. It also says this, Catholic educators are called to go beyond all ideological reductionism, homologizing relativism, so making everything one, by remaining faithful to their own gospel-based identity in order to transform positively the challenges of their times into opportunities by following the path of listening, reasoning, and proposing the Christian vision while giving witness by their very presence and by the consistency of their words and deeds. So if we talk about human dignity and loving human persons, we must love every human person, okay? Including those people who experience gender dysphoria. In fact, in many ways, you'd have to say we really should love them even more, because I think that's probably one of the biggest things that is not functioning as it should in their life. The authentic and full wraparound love of other human persons. So, unjust discriminations of people experiencing gender dysphoria is always wrong. Now, let me point out this word and why I've bolded it though. Unjust is profoundly important. Because there might actually be legitimate limitations you place, but what happens today is people sort of say, well, that's unjust if you don't let me have my way. That's not what unjust actually means. So any form of discrimination that was actually unjust. So let's say that let's say it was a Catholic school, and they were constantly mocking and ridiculing people who were experiencing gender dysphoria. It's a form of unjust discrimination. They're failing to respect the human dignity of those persons who are experiencing this difficult issue. There are 3 models or therapeutic responses that have been proposed as a way to respond to this issue. So the first is this, what's called conversion or reparative therapy. And what this is about is always attempting to make the child more comfortable in their natal, their birth sex, and dissuading them from identifying as the opposite sex. So you're deliberately trying to assist them and you're trying to help them to become comfortable in that. So you're proactively working to do that. The second model is what is sometimes called watching and waiting. This is making the child comfortable in their natal sex. So you do that part, but there's no encouragement of actually, you're not encouraging them to live out the opposite. And what you would do is, in certain families or places, there would be limitations put on places and times. So if you've got a child who is constantly wanting to dress as the opposite gender because they believe they're the opposite gender, you might have limits on that. But you would never encourage it either. You would never say, oh, that's good, that's your new gender, you should embrace that and you do you, or any of that kind of stuff. Now, in both of these cases, the reasons for gender dysphoria are explored with the child with the aim of reducing the intensity of the dysphoria. So you're actually recognising that it's a proper psychological confusion and you're trying to help the person to deal with that confusion. The third model, which is now what you would call the public policy model, which is a problem and as Catholics we could never embrace, is what is called affirmative therapy, which is actively encouraging, supporting or facilitating transitioning of any form. Saying to a person, yes, you are actually right, you aren't really a male, you are a female, you should socially transition or you should medically transition, that would never be acceptable. Now, what's interesting here, because we're starting to deal with this in New Zealand now, in our Catholic schools in particular, a lot of them are getting caught on the hop. They're sitting back and waiting. It's the worst thing we can do. We've actually got to develop good policies. And what I'm saying to any school that asks me about this issue is I think that you could easily adopt this policy here in your schools and proactively do that. And you could say we have basic limitations, so you can't have someone appearing at an all-boys school dressing up in a female uniform and presenting as a female, but they won't be discriminated against, they won't be made fun of. So basically, we are not going to encourage that. We're not going to set up support groups in our schools that would encourage the ideology. And to the credit of our bishops in New Zealand, they released a document from the Education Office a couple of months ago, and they said exactly that. They said Catholic schools should not have transgender or gender identity support groups in them. So they were very clear on that. But what they should do is to say to people, this is the model we embrace. And so what you're doing is you're saying this is what the data shows us, that if we don't intervene, the majority of these people will actually become comfortable in their gender identity. And so it would be extremely wrong of us to interfere with that process. We'd actually be harming their dignity by doing that. Unfortunately, what's happening is in a lot of places, we're sitting back and waiting. That's the worst thing. We've actually got to grapple with this issue and embrace it and actually foment genuinely caring and authentically Catholic policies in response. We need to be courageous in telling the truth, because human flourishing is not waiting at the end of transitioning. It just isn't. I was speaking at a youth conference, a big evangelical youth conference in Christchurch a couple of weeks ago, and a young man came up to me and said, what do I do? He said, my best friend in high school is now going through transitioning. What do I do? I said, you just got to love that person, because what they think is waiting for them at the end of this is fulfillment and happiness. It's not. And so what you've got to do is be that voice of loving reason, and I mean genuine love, that is willing to be with that person and to love them and to show the friendship of Christ to them without ever endorsing something that would be so contrary to their human dignity. If I see a person swimming around in a pool of effluent, if I say to them, oh, good on you, you do you, you've really found yourself, I'm so happy for you, that's not a loving act. They might be okay with me doing that. That's not a loving act. The most loving thing to do would be to say to that person, hey, I think it's a good idea if you get out of that pool. What would be really loving is if you climb down in there with them and help them to get out of it. Right? And I think that's our model. That's what we're supposed to be doing. Some resources if you want to follow up and do some further reading. Ryan T. Anderson wrote a very good book about 2 years ago called When Harry Became Sally, which explores all of the data. It's a very serious book, despite the title. There's a website called fourthwavenow.com. It's a community of parents and others who are concerned about the medicalisation of gender atypical youth, so youth who experience gender dysphoria. And it says, basically their approach is it's wrong to medicalise them and try and actually complete transitioning. Transgendertrend.com. It's for those concerned about the social and medical transition of children and the introduction of gender identity teaching in schools. There's a lot of very good and well-presented information on that website. Sexchangeregret.com. It's a site for people who regret changing their genders or those wanting to know more about the transition process and the sort of the truth of what actually happens in the experiences of people who now have regret about that. Gendercriticalresources.com, which is a discussion and support, discussion board for parents and families who share the experience of coping with a child, teenager or young adult who believes that he or she is transgender. It's about equipping the parents with support they need. And the easiest way I thought to do this was to give you a short link, which I'll just leave on here so you can copy if you want to. But there's a study there about which explores rapid onset gender dysphoria in adolescents and young adults. And what it does is from 2018, and it studies the parental reports, what the parents are saying about that experience, which is really important. And it's interesting because there's a lot of what I would call very informative data from those experiences that we need to glean that's not being gleaned.
I'm here with Limo. Limo, we were just in a session with listening to Brendan Malone talking about one of the really sensitive topics that is really out there today, transgenderism. And just what was your experience of the session, Limo?
A big thing I took out of all that was how misguided and how our education system's put in such a way where we actually thought that, you know, as a young person, you're actually structured to believe in everyone accepted, meaning any rule is accepted, whereas the sense of guidance for someone is kind of taken out of place. And what I was discussing with a mate before was how up till, for example, the age of 18, as children or as growing, maturing students, there's only so much we know about the world and so much we have learnt. And getting to that stage, we can't accept everything is right until we know. So with all the information given, it's up to us understanding like why we feel certain ways, why for example, something Jed said before was that understanding our deeper desires before taking something for face value, for example. And yeah, that's pretty much what I got out of that, yeah.
Thank you.
You're doing something new in me, God. Stirring up the song in my heart. I'm waiting, holding to your word, covenant and promise to. I will never turn back, God. This is all that I desire. What I'm created for, I surrender my heart to where you're moving. Place you first in all I'm doing. I know where I belong. I am loved. I give you first fruits in my life, the best part of my soul. Everything I desire, God, Lord, I'll sing. Renew your will in me. Show me that true identity. Oh, it's found in you. It's found in you. I give you first. I give you first fruit.
Shalom World brings to you the Catholic faith in all its different dimensions. It can be a faith to inspire you in your own living of your Catholic life in society. Shalom World offers you an opportunity of being enriched and strengthened in your family life. We live in a culture that needs to have a Catholic presence. We live in a culture that needs to be evangelized by the presence of Catholic teaching and the inspiration to live according to our Catholic way of life. I recommend to you to be involved in the work of Shalom World. May the Lord bless you and bless the work of Shalom World. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.